Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We're so thrilled that you're here and joining us for today's Powering Inclusion Forum with the Center for Economic Inclusion. I'm Tawana Black. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion, and today's programming is on measuring Minnesota's public policy efforts to close racial wealth gaps with racial equity impact notes. Today, we are excited to dive deep on our opportunities to ensure that not only our state legislatures, but also our local and regional governments have the tools and are operating in shared accountability with our communities in order to drive public policies that truly are closing our racial wealth gaps. We're excited that so many of you have registered for today's program. In fact, over 350 people are registered today, and we're excited to dig into an amazing program with some phenomenal leaders who are doing the hard work in our communities to reckon with racism and drive regional economies that truly work for all of us. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to dig right into our discussion on today, but first, a few reminders as always for our forum. We hope that while you're gathering for lunch, maybe with your coworkers, friends, and family, that you'll take advantage of ordering lunch and grabbing some takeout from our local businesses, in particular, our Black and Brown-owned businesses in our community. You can go over to our website at centerforeconomicinclusion.org and find links to many of these businesses that you see featured on our screen right now, because we know that it's truly important that we buy local so that we're not saying goodbye to some of the best local businesses in our community, and that we're enabling them to create more jobs that pay family sustaining wages in our communities to continue to grow an inclusive regional economy. So take advantage of these businesses today and every day in order to continue to drive that great regional economy that we want to have. Today, I also want to say a big thank you to our sponsors. These foundations and corporations continue to invest in our ability here at the Center for Economic Inclusion to host programs like this one and to continue to empower more than 15,000 leaders a year to come together, to connect, and to learn. So please help me by saying thank you to these foundations and businesses like the Kauffman Foundation, Allianz, Best Buy, Bush Foundation, Kresge Foundation, Varde, 3M, C.H. Robinson, Comcast, and Mortensen, who have invested in the Powering Inclusion series, our Powering Inclusion Summit coming up in February, and our Reckoning to Rise series, and helping us continue to grow opportunities to learn together, build awareness, take action together, and build shared accountability for building regional economies that work for everyone, building workplaces that are truly anti-racist, and ensuring that we close racial wealth gaps together. We thank these sponsors, and we also invite you to consider ways that you can invest in helping the Center for Economic Inclusion achieve our vision and our goals by going to our website and visiting our donate button and identifying ways that you can continue to invest in this work as well. Thank you to these sponsors. Right now, I want to give you an opportunity to participate actively in today's program by letting us know who's in the room. We're going to start some live polling now and give you a chance to let us know who you are, how you're showing up both in the world and in this work, and how this work is resonating with you and what actions you've taken since participating in some of the center's programming. You'll see an indicator come up on your screen now that gives you an opportunity to go to the Menti website and begin to answer some questions, and we'll show you the responses to those questions right now. So you see a number coming up on your screen right now. You can go to menti.com or use the QR code and begin to answer some questions there. The first question is about your racial identity, and you can answer that question for us. Let us know who you are. We're starting to see some of those responses come in even already now. You missed the code. We can see if we can bring that code back up. It looks like we might have gone a little bit fast there. The QR code is on the screen, and if you didn't catch the actual number, it's 6813 and 6561 at menti.com. If you're mobile, there's a QR code on the screen right now. You can take a shot at that or go to menti.com and then 6813 and 6561 is the code that you'll enter once you go to that site. Give you a moment to go there. Once you're there, you'll see a few questions there. We'll begin to ask some questions, both first about the demographics. At the center, you all know we have a real focus on being sure that we're engaging a broad population across racial backgrounds and age and gender identity, but also that we're getting people across different sectors in order to be sure that we're really reckoning with all these opportunities across the different sectors, not only in our region, but also other regions across our areas. I'll ask our team to put in that code in the chat. We've got a couple of folks who are just coming in, so I'll ask our team to drop that code into the chat for you. So it looks like we've got some diversity across our different backgrounds here. Awesome. We'll continue to monitor this as we go along through our day today, through our program. We'll continue to monitor this. So our racial backgrounds are showing up with some diversity. Now we'll look at what we're polling with here for our age backgrounds. The answers here are starting to come forward. All right, it looks like our generations here between the 25 to 34-year-olds and our 45 to 54-year-olds might have the largest majority right now, with our 18 to 24 and our over 75-year-olds having the smaller groupings, at least at this stage right now. But I love to see that we do have some attendance there over 75 and at the 18 to 24-year-olds. I love that we've got some spread across each one of these demographics. It's great to see here in the room. Excellent. Excellent. Let's look at what our gender identity is looking like. Okay. Seeing here with our word cloud, the size is giving us some indication of how we're all showing up and what words we're using to define our identity here. So you can see we're getting some good diversity in our gender identity in the audience on today. Excellent. I love that Menti gives us an opportunity as both the words continue to move around a little bit to be able to monitor and see how this continues to move a little bit and how more answers are continuing to come in. We've got diversity in the room and gender identity as well, and continuing to come in the room as well. Excellent. And now we're moving to the number of events that you've attended with the center. Do we have some first timers in the room with us? Excellent. We've got a number of people between those of you who might have been at your first event. Welcome, first timers. We're thrilled to see you here for the first time. We've also got a number of people who have been to more than 4 events with the center, and some folks who might have been at just your first event. Perhaps you were just here with us last month for the Project Vanguard release, or our event in June where we released our new indicators digital lab. We'll share a link to that here in just a moment, or our new racial equity dividends index report, or maybe one of the reckoning series events earlier this year or in a previous year. So some good diversity in terms of the engagement in previous events. Excellent. Now, this last question is one of the most important questions beyond who you are and where you show up in the world. And that is how you're using the information that you're gathering, the relationships that you're building as you come into these center events. It's really important to us that while we gain information is important, at the center, one of our biggest goals for existing is that we help people gain awareness and information, but then that we take that information and start to take action, and that we're taking that action in solidarity across sectors, across racial identities, and across communities. And so we'd like to hear from you on today. Have you taken action to drive change inside your workplace? Are you taking action that might be in the people industry, that might be about workforce development or supplier diversity, philanthropic advancements and policies and strategies, or perhaps in your core areas of business, your products and services, in order to advance changes in a particular market or population? We'd love to hear how you're doing the work that you're doing and how this information is helping you drive your organizational outcomes and how you're advancing that. It looks like we've got a number of different ways that you all are using the information that you're gathering at the center and our events in order to drive change. This is great. I love to see the first answer there, that you're using these engagements to drive relationships. We know that social capital is critical to our ability in communities to close racial wealth gaps and really drive change. It's also great to see here that we've got some cross-sector impact happening here, that everything from philanthropic changes to changes in workforce development, and that we're seeing some impacts in supplier diversity and ultimately some impacts in the ways that we're driving economic development and marketplace changes. Later on, we'll show an opportunity for you to see some of the tools that we have here at the center to help you and how you use these tools inside your business. And we'll see some of the diversity that we've seen in some of those reports in terms of where businesses in the Minnesota arena are really struggling. And we hope that you'll take advantage of those tools and that help that you can get here at the center in order to use these resources even more inside your organizations. I want to encourage you as we move from this survey into the discussion today to be sure that you're taking this discussion online. Please share this today online with your friends and social media. So if there's someone who isn't registered, encourage them to join this discussion now on YouTube by sharing the link out on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, or on LinkedIn. We also want to share today our handles with you and those of our speakers so that you can also tag us in your posts. Encourage us with the hashtag Powering Inclusion, and be sure that you're tagging folks who are speaking today with aha moments, things that resonate with you in the discussion, so that we can also continue this conversation with you for many days and weeks to come, because we know that this topic is one that's going to be particularly important as we go into the election in the coming weeks and into the legislative session. So we don't want it to end, and be sure that we also know you and can connect with you as this conversation moves forward. I want to take a moment to share a bit with you about the Center for Economic Inclusion in case you haven't gotten to know us very deeply yet. Our purpose here at the center, as the nation's first organization created exclusively to dismantle systemic racism and equip employers in order to dismantle that racism inside their own organizations and build regional economies that work for everyone, is to do just that. Our values are rooted in love, being humbly confident leaders, and working in shared accountability. And our commitment is to work together in order to connect over 1,000 leaders together with the tools that they need in order to build regional economies that truly work for everyone, such that they're touching the lives of other people and helping them build regional economies and workplaces that work for everyone. We're doing that work together today, not only here in Minnesota, but across the country in ways that are truly transforming the lives of many different organizations and workplaces, and hoping to build a workplace that truly works for everyone. Our team of organizations is working with many different folks across the country, and we want to be able to do that work with you. If there are ways that we can support you, please contact us at action@centerforeconomicinclusion.org, and members of our team will follow up with you after today's forum in order to support you and find out ways that we can bring our tools to you. I'd like to share just a little bit about the ways that we go about building. We're an organization that works across sectors, particularly with the public and private sectors, as we'll talk about today. We advocate and lobby for anti-racist, local and federal policy and state changes. We build broad awareness about the case for economic imperatives for closing racial wealth gaps. And we work to drive action and shared accountability for closing those racial wealth gaps, because we recognize that together we're better, but we have to be aligned on the strategies and solutions that are required to move our communities forward, both here in Minnesota and across the nation. And we're investing in the Black talent and Black employers and businesses that we believe can begin to move our communities forward by directly investing in Black-led organizations, particularly in North Minneapolis, who are building the talent that will fuel our region's economy, and in Black and Latino-owned businesses who are also creating family-sustaining jobs that will fuel the future of our economy. Lastly, we have a strong consultancy that offers meaningful products and tools to Minnesota's businesses and economies and Minnesota's public sector organizations that you'll see in just a moment, where we're helping to transform the way that they approach their organizations toward closing racial wealth gaps and building organizations that truly embody the values of equity and inclusion. Our promise is to bring the best of who we are, an organization that's racially diverse, that's data informed, and that's equipped to help transform those organizations. We build in these ways to be able to successfully help organizations thrive. These are a few of the organizations who we've been able to help over the last year. We are thankful for the partnership with these organizations. We're grateful for their investment in helping Minnesota and other places across the country truly transform their economies by investing in their talent, by investing in the supply chain in their communities, by investing in the principles of learning what it truly is to be anti-racist, and investing in the public policies that are necessary to undo histories of systemic racism. It doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen easily, but it can happen when we work together. Over the last couple of years, over 15,000 people have participated in forums like this, both virtually in environments and Zoom rooms and face-to-face, reckoning with America's history of racism, with Minnesota's history of racism, and co-creating a future that is much different than what we've experienced today. Together, we believe we can build a future that is not only anti-racist, but is also inclusive and equitable. Together, we can write the story of what it means to measure that and to successfully experience it. We've developed a few tools that we want to highlight for you today if you haven't seen them, so you can take advantage of them on our website. The first is our Racial Equity Dividends Index, a report on how Minnesota's businesses are faring on the leading standards of anti-racist business practices. We encourage you to take advantage of this report and to prepare, if you haven't participated in it, to take advantage of the next version coming out very soon. We also invite you to take advantage of the indicators for an inclusive regional economy. This first of its kind digital lab allows users to learn more about not only disparities in our community, but opportunities to invest more deeply in closing racial employment, income, and wealth gaps, and understanding how gaps in housing, lending, commercial lending, and housing lending, education, and other arenas connect together to shape the fabric of our economy, both today and the trends that we can look toward in the future, and the economic imperative for each one of our entities to take different actions. And lastly, our opportunity to be investing more deeply in a supply chain that is truly fueled with racial inclusion and equity. Our report on Project Vanguard helps corporations understand the unique opportunity that we have to be investing deeply in fueling a supply chain that is brought by the best in communities of color of businesses who are creating jobs that pay family-sustaining wages and bringing products and services to bear that are innovative and can help Minnesota's companies truly grow and prosper right here in our own state. These reports offer solutions that every business and every state agency and local government agency in our state needs and can benefit from. And we're pleased and humbled to be able to bring these tools to bear for each of you. We're also excited to release a new report for you on today. Almost 2 years ago, our policy and research teams at the Center for Economic Inclusion partnered with Voices for Racial Justice and a coalition of local and racial economic justice leaders and employers to advocate for a bill to design the foundation for racial equity impact notes to achieve goals of more transparent public policy and more racially equitable public policy. We recognize that while it's not new to embed racial equity frameworks into public policy, we're calling for a need for frameworks that actually ensure that government is serving everyone more effectively and addressing the root causes of the symptoms of racism that so many government programs are designed to address, from energy to farming, jobs and business development, labor, health and human services, State decision-making must become more accountable, more transparent, and more equitable. That requires more clarity when bills are created. It requires more measurable results when those bills are designed, and accessible opportunities and more discussions about who those bills are designed for and who those bills are creating results for, and a process for the people to be able to measure those results as dollars are allocated and policies are instituted. Almost 2 years ago, when we partnered together with Voices for Racial Justice and a coalition of local and racial economic justice leaders to advocate for a bill to design the foundation for racial equity impact notes to achieve this goal, despite the bold leadership of Representative Samantha Vang and Senator Champion, who sponsored our bills in the House and Senate, fears of growing of government and working with communities stopped those bills in their tracks. We didn't stop. We decided that these values were important and invested in the research to further this goal. Today, we're sharing this research with you with a report that you can access on our website. And we're talking about the path forward toward a state with regional economies that truly work for everyone. We're sharing our own policy agenda with you, the opportunity for us to move policy priorities forward that help our state continue to prosper and ensure that everyone in our state does prosper. Ensuring that racial equity impact notes, a tool that helps policymakers understand before a bill is passed whether or not that bill will truly close gaps or might cause disparate impacts, and to what extent, is in place, and ensuring that decision-making is collective with stakeholders is in place and measured. And a tool and policy priorities for procurement reforms with our state to increase the size and number of contracts with Black and Brown owned businesses, and increasing capital investment in those businesses in our state to support accelerated growth of those businesses, to increase job creation and wealth creation building with our supply chains across our state. We're honored to be doing this work together with our policy partners. We're honored to be doing this work with legislators who have been committed to this work for so long. And at this time, I'm honored to be able to introduce our panel for a conversation. Would you join me in being able to welcome to our panel right now 4 of our panelists for a discussion? I'd like to introduce to each of you right now our 4 panelists. First, Representative Rena Moran from the Minnesota House of Representatives, Anna Mingi, who is Assistant Commissioner for Budget Services and the State Budget Director at the Minnesota Department of Management and Budget, Bayong Mua, who is Director of Racial and Health Equity and Advocacy at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota. And last but certainly not least, Representative Muhammad Noor, who is with the Minnesota House of Representatives. Thank each one of you for not only joining me today, but for your fearless leadership and partnership in pursuit of regional economies that work for everyone and state policies that are truly working for everyone. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I want to start with a question that I'll ask each one of you to respond to and share with our audience on today. We just talked about, the center and our policy partners have been advocating for racial equity impact notes in order to ensure that as policies are proposed with a framework of closing gaps among people of different races and ethnicities, that policymakers and their constituents have greater knowledge and understanding about the extent to which this will occur. Can you share in your own words why this is important from your perspective and what's not working today that may make this necessary? And I may start from where I left off with introductions and start with you, Representative Noor.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Tawana Black and Center for Economic Inclusion and everyone else who joined us this afternoon. This is an important conversation. I think when we look at legislative process, what we say about the budget, it's our moral document. And what we say about our policy, it's our shared value, our common sense of being human beings and also being Minnesotans. It's a reflective of who we are. And I think having racial impact notes, as we do in the fiscal impact notes that go also with the local impact notes, I'm fortunate enough to be one of the first members to be sitting at the Legislative Budget Office as one of the commissioners. And what we do, we've been looking at legislative, but we tend to forget there's an impact on everyone what we do. The budget impact, the fiscal impact of it, how we spend our resources, the assumptions, analysis that are being done by the departments, and the value that we bring to the table. So this is an important aspect of it. Who are we impacting, or who are we leaving behind when we set up legislative process? We know that in the state of Minnesota, we do so well in many aspects of life, from education to health to home ownership and everything else. And yet we continue to see persistent income and wealth inequality in our state. We also continue to see how our students are impacted by the decisions we make at the state capitol. If we cannot fix that issue, it means that we have failed each and every Minnesotan, because we failed to do what is necessary and sometimes what is difficult. And that is something I think we need to shift from what we're doing today to make sure that we address our common sense, our way of doing things in a different process, and having a racial impact note will really help us address that need. So I wanted to give that opportunity to my other colleagues to reflect on what it means to have a racial impact note.
Absolutely appreciate that. We come over to you, Representative Moran.
Well, good afternoon, Ms. Black, and want to thank you and the Center for Economic Inclusion for really facilitating this issue that is definitely needed here in the state of Minnesota. And one of the reasons I believe it's needed is because we have some of the worst disparities right here in the state of Minnesota that is really impacting our communities of color, by BIPOC communities. And so, so let me say, we have 201 legislators in the body in the state of Minnesota. And I'm glad that you opened up by saying the work you do is, it comes with being grounded in love, right? So I want folks to know that what I say is grounded in love, right? But we have 201 legislators. And we're making decisions in every area, from economic development to education to housing, all the issue areas that we know are bearing heavily on our BIPOC community. We're making those decisions about how we can, in my hope, improve people's lives. And in doing that, people can only come to this work through the lenses that they have, and hope that they are doing good. Right. And so I wouldn't say that most decisions are intentional. I think most decisions about what that looks like is not in the disparities that we see are not intentional, but they are reflections of policies and investments that have been made. And as my colleague, Representative Noah, said, that our budget is a moral document of what we value. And so if the question is, if we value eliminating the disparities that we see that are inundating our state, then we have to have intentionalities in the policies and practices and investments that we're making. So for myself, like being like chair of the Ways and Means Committee, with myself and Ruth Richardson, Representative Ruth Richardson, where we declared racism a public health crisis, and then we created a select committee on racial justice, was really the ground making for our colleagues to see that the policies, the investments, and the practices at the state level have not always been fair and just. They have been disproportionately impacting our BIPOC community. And if we're going to do better, we have to be intentional in that process. So saying clearly to them that we have some of the worst disparities in the country, and that, you know, I shared an impact tool with them, right, that they can utilize. Just in case you don't know how to do that and what that looks like, we have to introduce those concepts to the body and say, this is the way we're going to bring our budget forward in the House. A budget that is looking at the disparities, been very intentional, and then say to ourselves how the work that we are doing and our budget that we are creating and putting together will be done through a race equity lens, because race matter. And as elected officials, we have the power and the obligation and the responsibility to make sure that we are doing no further harm. And so I say that to say that having a racial impact note on everything that we're looking at is crucially important. And it's also important that when we are making our decisions, we are looking at it and working in partnership with those communities to also be able to say, this bill, this investment, I believe, is going to be a part of reducing the racial disparities that we are seeing in the state of Minnesota. And so that has been a part of my work ever since I've been in the legislature. I always brought a race equity lens to the table. One, because as a Black woman, as a Black mother, I don't know how to do that any other way, but to say that you're doing this and it's not working for my community. And why don't we think about doing it this way and be able to do that and do it in a way that can be received, that people are open to moving forward and to be open to bringing our diverse voices into the legislative body so that we can be a part, so our communities can be a part of that process of creating the outcome and having the impact that we want here in the state of Minnesota, in the state of Minnesota, and in the legislature.
Thank you so much for that. Bayong, I'm gonna come over to you.
Yeah, it's pronounced Vajong. Sorry, it's not
Sorry.
spelled phonetically, so it's all good.
Thank you.
First of all, just thanks to CEI for this gathering and prioritizing racial equity in governance and in policymaking. The significance, in my view, is there's two things I would want to just emphasize. And this is a definition from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that a health inequity is a difference in health that is avoidable, preventable, and unjust. And so I think just the name of prevention itself illuminates the significance of a racial equity impact note, right? We have insights and knowledge to shape public policy and community impact. And so I just want to, emphasize that these inequities are not inevitable. They are completely avoidable and unjust, and we have the ability to transform that. The other significance I'll lift up is that if we are proclaiming and rightfully recognizing that racism is structural and rooted in racist policies, then we should counter that with racial equity rooted policies. And so for too long, I think we've been mismatched in throwing programmatic or only educational solutions at a structural problem. And so I think it's time for us to seed racial and intersectional equity criterion, principles, analysis upstream into the decision-making process, whether that's at the legislature or at a health plan or at a foundation. And so I think for those two reasons, I think we have the ability and accountability to begin working upstream in a preventative manner, in a structural approach to make sure that these racial and intersectional inequities are truly snuffed out before they get any kind of traction. I do want to pay tribute to my fellow panelists. These are my heroes. These are people who I admire and cheer on. And so thank you for your leadership in grounding this in a moral and social justice argument, and recognizing that this isn't a mechanical tool. We're not talking about a technical issue here, right? The significance here is that we are weaving a democratic value into the policy-making process. And so I just want to make sure that even though we're talking about a racial equity impact note, this is not a technical conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely agree. Anna.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. I echo just huge admiration for my fellow panelists and super humbled to be a part of this conversation. I think for me, what drives the urgency in this work is what others have said before me. In Minnesota, we have some of the biggest gaps between white Minnesotans and Black and brown Minnesotans across every indicator, health and housing and income and wealth. But how can we address those gaps if we don't know what we're doing and if we don't know the impact of what we're proposing? As the state budget director, it's my job to say state government spends tens of billions of dollars every year. But we, without the analysis of how it's serving Minnesotans, we're really limited in our ability to influence those gaps. And what we tend to look at when making, policy decisions is the impact on the whole, the impact to the state as a whole. But we know that policies don't impact every Minnesotan the same way. And that's the value that this analysis can bring to the policymaking conversation. But I also think there's a more subtle influence. And so someone reminded me of the phrase, we measure what we value. And I think that by just asking for this analysis and pushing for the analysis, it changes the culture of the organizations in which we work to influence the proposals that we bring to the table, the way they're designed, and the way we engage with communities. So I think it's a really exciting effort with some really direct benefits, but also some more subtle indirect changes as well.
Absolutely. Appreciate that as well. First of all, I'm on a high now from each one of the comments that I've received here from each one of you, and appreciate in particular a couple of notes are really standing out to me. One is the notion certainly that budgets are moral documents, and your notion that you lifted up here so poignantly, Rajan, that we are dealing with things that are not social issues, but are structural issues. This is preventable. The inequities that we're facing and are so often trying to apply social solutions to are preventable and are avoidable, and yet are not often discussed that way and are not often solved that way in terms of the way that we're applying solutions. And I want to also lift up what Representative Noor noted. Representative Moran came behind that and I think underscored as well that budgets should be moral documents, and yet our discourse does not go to that point. I want to ask our policymakers first to maybe give some light for folks who may not know a lot about the Select Committee recommendations and what has occurred since the Select Committee recommendations came forward, and what might be informed if we were to have racial equity impact notes on the books right now in Minnesota. When we think about other impact notes that are in use right now, if we were to have a tool like this that helped not only be a suggestive tool really, but really gave some teeth to it, really to hold policymakers' feet to the fire, to really measure whether or not policies are going to exacerbate disparities, leave them stagnant, or help to close them. How might we see some progress from those recommendations that both of you and your colleagues worked so hard to bring forward?
I guess I would start off. I don't have the recommendations in front of us, and maybe afterwards I click off and go get them so you can see some of the work that has been done. Because we brought forth, I think, 80+ recommendations in all system areas of how we can begin to see the reduction of disparities within our states. So I open up and, I wish I could be a little bit more positive, but we live in a body of a legislature that is a divided legislature. We are the only divided legislature in the country. And that means to the people who are listening that those who are in the majority, the majority has the power to decide what that moral document of a budget is going to look like, and how we're going to look at moving legislation and dollars through the body. In the House, we were a majority, and in the Senate, there were, so in the House, there's a Democratic majority, in the Senate, there's a Republican majority. And a lot of times what that means is that we're clashing on values, we're clashing on what racial equity looks like, we are clashing on even using the words equity. So first of all, so we can be clear about when people is not understanding why things are not as far as it needs to be, or why isn't we just using that tool? It makes sense. Well, not everyone believes that it makes sense, and not everyone believes that we need to do our work through that type of racial equity lens. So what the things that we were able to do in the Minnesota House that was very intentional around looking at Black maternal health, making sure that we're not suspending our babies in pre-K, right? We're doing that when we know how important those first 5 years of life is. We're looking at how we can invest in more, not just eliminating homelessness, but how can we make sure that, we have a BIPOC community and there's a pathway to home ownership that creates wealth, that we're looking at our work through a lens of economic development to make sure that we are supporting small Black BIPOC businesses, that there are intentional investment in that. And then, by the way, we also want to make sure that we're doing workforce training to get people in our community trained and prepared so that they can have livable, sustainable jobs, so that they can take care of their families. So we have to do it all of that, but we have to know that, and I want the community to know that in this process of looking at the legislature, and looking at legislators leading through a lens of racial equity, that we need community. We need you to know that the legislature exists, that in 2023 is going to be a budget year, that we're going to spend almost $50 billion, and legislators are going to be making a decision about what that moral document that we call a budget looks like, and we cannot and should not be doing that without your input and your insight and your expertise, helping us to decide what that looks like. Because legislators who are not BIPOC, I want to say that they're coming to the table with good intent to do the best that they know with what they have in front of them, or what they know to bring forth that's going to work for our community. And I know our community don't want people to be making decisions for us. We want you to be working with us. So we need your experience. We need your expertise. We need you to be helping us think about what do that racial lens look like, and how to speak to legislators who believe and align with your vision, but also how you can speak to those who don't see that as their vision, right? That it's not about race. Even though the foundation of America was based on race and slavery, we can't continue to do this work through a colorblind lens. We know that solutions is only going to be made better when we can look at it through race and fairness and justice, which is all about equity. We're not asking for something extra, but as legislators, where there are 201 different bodies that represent you in some type of way, whether you live in Minnesota somewhere, we're representing your voice, or maybe not. And if we're not, I'm saying to you that doing this work through a racial equity agenda, using a racial equity impact assessment and toolbox is the way to go and to help legislators do their work in a way that foundationally they wouldn't do it. But it is definitely a tool that is needed. An impact assessment, impact tools, all of that is needed to help legislators create stronger policies that do no more harm, but in a bigger picture that begins to chip away at the inequities and disparities that we see, because they're coming from our worldview of what that needs to look like.
Well stated, Chair Moran. I think the House Resolution 1, when we passed in June, I believe in 2020, that was what we were one of the first state legislators. In fact, it didn't go through the Senate. This was just a single body. That was the House, with the leadership of Representative Ruth Richardson and Chair Moran. We were able to get that done. As I reflect back, I think my statement on the floor was, this is not about Republican or Democrat. It's not about conservative or liberal. This is about between right and wrong. So we've seen so many wrong things in our society that we cannot be sitting back and waiting for somebody else to take the right appropriate actions. So when you look at what we have seen during the pandemic, which significantly impacted the BIPOC community, 2 in 3 Black Minnesotans were laid off. As we even look at the data right now, we have got the lowest unemployment ever in the whole country. And yet it's at 1.9%. For Black Minnesotans, it's 7.3%. So reflect on that and see where we're lacking, because our policies are supposed to be helping each and every Minnesotan so that we can remove the barriers and the obstacles that many people are facing. Just at a simple level, that economic inclusion where you have individuals who are given the opportunity to thrive, people are tired of just being told you can survive. The moment that we have right now is to ask ourselves, what are we missing? That 7.3% Black Minnesotans are still unemployed. The underlying issue that many people don't want to talk about it's racism. We're not giving people that opportunity, the tools that they need to become more economically sustainable and to support their families and to provide what is needed. And sometimes we tend to be quiet on things that are happening. When we look at the housing infrastructure, we're fighting for resources based on the framework of the select committee that created that. We're dealing with one of the most significant inequity when it comes to home ownership. Just about 20-something percent of Black Minnesotans own homes. When you look at white Minnesotans, it's 80%. So if this is not a major challenge, if we cannot invest and provide the resources, even right now, the list market that you can find a home in the Twin Cities is $350,000, 7-point-something% interest rate. No one in the community who's earning the minimum wage will be able to afford that. So we have to be sincere to one another. We have to be able to provide the resources to give people a hand up rather than a hand out. So they're willing to survive and to be able to build a future that we can all say, this is more inclusive, this is more sustainable, this reflects of who we are as a state. I can go on and on. I think some of the key issues that we solved through this process is use the federal funds. Just a quick example that the state of Minnesota just recently received $97 million. The intent for the funding is to make sure that socially and economically disadvantaged individuals are included in that conversation. So this is a moment to look into how can we provide individuals the tools that they need, the capital, access to capital where there are no barriers, lower than the market right now, even if it's at 0%, so that we can allow small businesses who are starting up and those who are existing can receive the benefits that they deserve so that we can be more inclusive, have an inclusive economy that supports all of us. In healthcare, we've done so many things, something that Chair Moran just mentioned. Dignity in pregnancy was one of the key issues. We also made sure that the postpartum period is not only 2 months, it's a 12-month period. And now in the state of Minnesota, if a mother needs that coverage, she will get it up to 12 months. And so many things that we've fought so hard because of the framework that was created by the select committee. It's something that will live on. It's not 1 or 2 days. It's something that we need to be using it as we deliberate on our legislative process, as we make sure that we include the racial impact notes in every conversation. In fact, in my committee that I chair, one of the things that I've asked all the members is, how will this impact communities of color? And that's something that everyone has to explain in terms of the policy that they bring in front of us. So I think there's more to discuss, but there's a lot of work ahead of us.
Absolutely. I so appreciate both the work that you've done, but also the work you're articulating and lifting up. And one of the things that I heard Representative Moran, I believe, lifted up early on is that people can only come to this work with the lens that they have. Both of you and some of your peers in the Posse Caucus and the United Black Legislative Caucus have been committed to bringing communities of color, both Black nonprofit leaders, communities of color, nonprofit leaders, Black business owners to the table, convening over and over again before policies are created, not after they're created, just to testify, to say exactly what do you need. So we create the policy right. And I suspect some of that is because you remember what it's like to be excluded. You remember what it's like to have the policy created and then somebody coming in asking you, all right, just come testify about it and then help us get it passed. And you know that then the policy doesn't really work for you. I want to ask Vajang, who's been advocating for worker-led policies. I want to ask you, Anna, you mentioned earlier that you're managing the budget, but you know that so often these policies are created, the investments are allocated and deployed, even though the numbers are substantial. They're still not getting us where we need to be. And we know that resulting in the surplus we just came out of. What do we do to follow some of the examples that we have here around engaging the very stakeholders who should be engaged? How do we get more of that occurring to inform policy, to have rubrics like this racial equity impact note that we're bringing forward with our partners, and not, again, as the center says so frequently, not as charity, not as a nice thing, but because this is really going to move our state forward. This is good business. This is good economic policy.
Do you want to go first, Anna, or if I can just jump in, and I want to actually quickly just offer some comment on the significance of the House Select Committee's report, which I think is a great segue to the long-range community engagement question that you're bringing up. That report is profound for a few reasons. It not only does it list out a myriad of issues and showcases the gross and disturbing inequities across issues, whether it's housing, healthcare, employment, education, but it does it in a way that doesn't pit these issues against each other. It does it in a way that shows the compounding and cross-cutting effect of inequities. It recognizes that they don't cut neatly off at these borders. And so I want to lift that realization up. The other thing that is important to understand is that this is, to my knowledge, the first time the Minnesota House or any state legislature in the country has created a committee on racial justice. And so not only has it lifted up key issues, it has transformed the way policies are made and decided. So although it was targeted at the House, and we wish the Senate had one and that it was more bicameral, but I wanted to lift up the significance of changing the legislative practice and norms and the way policies are made. And so that I want to make sure that is understood here. To your question, Tawana, I think one of the benefits and prompts of this report and the committee has not only raised the significance of racial equity in policymaking, but it has really illuminated the importance of racial equity in community organizing, in coalition building, in philanthropy. And so it gives our so-called insiders, Representative Moran and Representative Noor, and all of our champions, an external counterpart. And so there is a policy caucus, but there also needs to be a policy caucus of advocates, that we have food justice advocates talking to transportation equity advocates, health equity advocates talking to employment. And so it's really a rallying tool and cross point for us to work and organize on the outside. And so I'm really glad to see many of my community partners and my mentors on this call too, and in the attendee list. And so I want to make sure that the focus on policymaking is honored and not minimized, but that the counterpart to that is racial and intersectional equity in organizing. Thus, you have relationships like Blue Cross partnering with CEI and Voices for Racial Justice, or the Public Health Association. And I think that's what is going to be needed to have a collective impact against racial inequities.
Yeah, I want to pause before you go forward just to underscore that and how important that is, because so often in this work, the issues, not just the issues, but then the organizations and the people working on them are pitted and almost forced to choose to work in isolation. And in isolation, you're forced to work against one another and against one another's issues. And we know that people don't live like that. Organizations are asked to serve people, and organizations, I know this from many of our peers we support, are asked to say, okay, use the housing dollars, but don't use the housing dollars to serve the same families who you're providing childcare assistance to, or who you're providing health and human services assistance to, as though the same families don't have multiple issues and needs. And so I just want to underscore what you're hitting on here, that public policy, not only lifting these issues up through the select committee, but having M&B, having organizations like Anna's, having policymakers recognizing this and lifting it up, having organizations like Blue Cross Blue Shield, other foundations elevating this, and not that organizations like ours and other racial and economic justice organizations don't know it, but almost giving permission for us to share and show what we know on the outside, so we don't have to hide and do this work, is huge, because we've been penalized for it for so long.
Great. So Tawana, maybe I'll jump in and say some of the things that we're working on right now. The top of mind for me is we're getting ready for the governor's budget recommendations, which will come out in January, which sounds like a long way away, but feels like a lot of work to get through. And this administration has really prioritized sort of building an analysis of equity into our budget proposal. So we started this sort of 2 years ago with the last biennial budget, and we are just continuing to learn and improve on it. And so when a state agency comes to MMB and the governor's office and says, I have a request for funding, I have an idea, here's my proposal, our form that everyone has to fill out has these questions called up, like, how does your proposal reduce or impact racial inequities? And what are those potential impacts? We also ask, have the intended beneficiaries of this policy been engaged in its development? Because the administration knows that it's crucial to have community have a seat in the policy development table. And that's crucial to closing these racial gaps. So one example of something the governor's office is doing is they've been convening a set of conversations with the African American community. Some of you may have heard of the Mind, Body, and Soul conversations, where state agencies start by giving a presentation of things that they're working on, but then spend a lot of time listening to feedback from the community. And using that information, agencies are going back, are putting together data-driven and data-informed proposals to close gaps between white Minnesotans and Black and Brown Minnesotans. And with the idea that we will continue to be in dialogue to say, here's what we heard, here's what we did we hit the mark? And that seems simple, but also I think you all know it's not the way that business has been done for a long time, or maybe ever. There are other things that we're doing in the administration to try to evaluate what are the impacts of our policy interventions and programs on racial inequalities and gaps. And we have a number of tools, things that we're doing here at MMB or in the results team that reports up through me, but also across state agencies. I'd highlight, for example, the equity review tool that the Department of Health and Human Services applied to every policy or proposal that came through the Blue Ribbon Commission a couple of years ago. And so we are continuing to try new things, and I think we're getting closer to hitting the mark. And we just want to keep talking with people to make sure that we are learning and growing and doing it right.
Absolutely. We are going to move to our audience Q&A now. I want to encourage our audience, if you've got questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, in addition, that's separate from your chat function. So we want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to drop questions there that we'll ask live here and answer. We've got a few that are already loaded, so we're going to go there now and begin our audience Q&A. So we've got one here that asks from Terrence Brown: in a charged and divisive political environment, how can we overcome the reaction that targeting funds to erase disparities may become a shared priority across party lines? So maybe it's that, how can we make sure that it does become a priority across party lines? Any takers?
If I may start, I think Assistant Commissioner Mingi just mentioned the biggest secret that many people may not be aware of. The state agencies are building their budget. They're building something that will be the recommendation based on the priorities of the governor. I know we have got election coming up in 12 days, but that's where it starts. There's so many things that are already ingrained in our system. For so many things, they're just left in a status quo, meaning that it's already spoken for. This is the time that we need to disrupt that process and say, yes, this has been the ongoing process. Everything is in the base. How do we make sure that we're more inclusive and disrupt the ongoing process that we're going to just touch the outside, few things that we can move around, rather than bringing the whole kit and caboodle to the table and say, where do we start from? How do we disrupt the ongoing process by just saying that this is a fiat process? It's already spoken for, without having the conversation with the communities and say, is this something that is working for specific communities within our state? That is something I think we can start influencing, and having that dialogue with the departments is key to making sure that our policies reflect what we want to see. Our budget then becomes our moral document. So there's a starting point. It's with the agencies, it's with the head of the agencies and the governor's office. And that's where we need to be able to provide the conversation should start somewhere from that agency and then become a legislative process.
So I agree with Representative Noor, absolutely. We have some work that we need to do, and it's going to take all of us to do this. I remember when Representative Richardson and I began to work on like the process for the Select Committee on Racial Justice, which is like one of the hardest things we had to do, and try to figure out how we can do this in a divided legislature, where some people will get uncomfortable. Probably most people get uncomfortable that didn't look like us, but to forge ahead and begin to plan accordingly, because we are like elected officials. And as we know, it was presidents and governors and city council members that created Jim Crow laws. So we had to share that history. And I think it's really important. And folks were thinking, you know, well, we're going into a legislative session. What if people don't read this? What if they don't get it? And our point was, this is not just about the legislature. This is for city councils. This is for the private sector, philanthropic, who can look at this, you know, end document and say, what are we doing? What is it that we need to be changing? How can we be a leader in eliminating the disparities, not at the state level, but like in our cities, in our counties, and in different areas of decision-making process? But it's really important that, for me, that our folks who are outside of the legislature know and believe that they have the power to have conversations with legislators in the governor's office, and look at departments who are in those different sectors, whether it's a healthcare sector or workforce sector, to begin to help them expand their worldview about what those solutions look like to begin to eliminate the disparities. We cannot do this by ourselves. And any change that's ever happened did not happen because legislators alone said, I'm going to free those slaves. It didn't happen that way, right? It happened for ordinary, everyday people standing up, having a voice in that decision-making process, and being in relationship with those who have the power to create the change that is needed. I think legislatively, we've grown as a body of diverse legislators. And when we begin to grow as a diverse legislators, that means that we are bringing in our life experience and our expertise and that knowledge into a body that historically had not been that diverse all at once. And so representation matters, being present matter, believing that you have something to share and give that's going to help our state, whatever sector you're in, to be better by interjecting your experience and your knowledge and your values into the decision-making process. Policies are important, practices are important, and investment in dollars are important. And if we're going to do that, we have to do it across all those sectors, but we also have to do it in a very comprehensive way, because families don't just live giving family support services or looking at workforce development. It is a comprehensive approach that entails all of that, not just one at one time, but all of it at the same time. So we need, and I'm glad the governor's office is using that tool. I heard that during last session, that is a tool that they're using to, an assessment tool that they was using to really begin to look at how it is going to eliminate the disparities. But more important, how's it going to lift up all people? How's it going to lift up the BIPOC community? How's it going to lift up children, family, and community? And that is something that we have to continue to do. And I am clearly inviting other people into this process to be the messenger of that message. We need your experience and your expertise and your knowledge in these rooms and places.
Absolutely. We have a question that asks, how would you hope that racial equity impact notes could be used as a long-term evaluative and educational tools to assess how policies are performing. And then in contrast, how might this tool be used to evaluate how current state policies could be updated to better address racial equity and ensure that communities are achieving equitable outcomes? And this could be open to anyone.
Maybe I'll start, and if any of my colleagues can add in. So I think, so my thinking about the racial equity impact notes is that they are really informing the legislative process, and they're sort of a point in time estimate, and that's just based on how fiscal notes are used. But that doesn't mean that's the end of the road for the evaluation. I think there are something that we're doing at MMB is we have a unit, something called the impact evaluation unit, and it's a group of researchers in MMB in our results management division that does these deep dive studies on state programs to understand what works, for whom, and under what circumstances. And so we really intentionally design them to make sure we're looking at how policies and programs impact different groups differently. In particular, race and ethnicity, or sex, or geography. And so there's a lot in common with the intent in terms of racial equity impact notes, but it's much longer term. Because I think these are, when you look at how our policies actually working, it is does require a level of rigor and analysis that is probably beyond some of the proposals around the racial equity impact notes. But I think in response to the second portion of that question, we do, I think, as I think about what our results team is doing when we are evaluating existing programs, we are looking really specifically for where are there ways we can nudge a program to change its impact, because there is really differential level of flexibility. Some programs are really prescriptive, the way agencies must implement them is laid out clearly in law. In other places, there's a lot of flexibility for agencies to then reflect on how things are working and what we can do differently. And so I think there is some opportunity there.
Anna, in those cases where you find those restrictions that are laid out in law, I know there are some places where we've run into the same thing, right? Where there are federal dollars that are tying a program's hands or a department's hands in their ability to adapt in ways that might help us get more equitable outcomes. And yet there tend to be opportunities where we could be mirroring state dollars in order to be less restrictive and be able to supplement those federal dollars and address those restrictions. And I think that's the opportunity where I think we could be more creative, be more responsive to what we're hearing, both from whether it's clients of a state program, whether it's from the people who are working in those departments, from policymakers and community as a whole. And is there opportunity to use a tool like racial equity impact notes, like the tools that you find in MMB, to not let the letter of the law of a program be the thing that holds us back, but be the thing that prompts us and motivates us to say, what is the end that we're seeking, and how do we marry resources together and marry tools together to make sure that it happens, right? But to not let getting to yes as opposed to always getting to no, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think we are doing a better job at looking holistically. So where we understand where there's a gap in an existing program, where might we have some flexibility to bring in other resources? And we're trying to identify that through some interagency working groups. So we understand you have this program, I have that program, how can we work together? Or I'm not sure if folks are familiar with we've done a fiscal map of all of the spending that the state does on children. And like the first step is just identifying the sources. And then the second step and the ultimate goal is that we figure out how we can leverage and maximize every single one of those dollars and focus on upstream spending to prevent, to be more efficient and have better outcomes for kids. But so I think, yes, there are some opportunities, and there are certainly other places where because of the way the state law is written and what we can and can't spend money on, we would need an extra appropriation or a state legislative change.
I think that's the real opportunity we have here, particularly as we look at the lessons learned both in Minnesota and other states in leveraging CARES Act dollars and other COVID relief funds, where the federal government gave us and other states complete free rein in order to just quickly get dollars out, be very responsive to the needs of families, to workers, and to businesses. And we saw results from that. And so there's a real opportunity and a need, I think, now for policymakers to take those lessons learned and say, where do we need to apply the same types of pressures to changing state laws, and use tools like racial equity impact notes then to change those policies. Representative Noor.
I think you're right. And this comes to the intentionality. I think Chair Moran spoke about that. And whenever we draft legislation, sometimes we put a reporting requirement and see how this impacts communities. So we have to be more intentional. What does that really look like? But also looking into how do we utilize the nonpartisan office of the legislative budget that can really help, because the fiscal notes are housed under them. They look into the reasonableness, effectiveness, the impact, which is being done by the agencies. But because we do have control of what's happening within that framework, we can try to improve the lives of everyone. So just a quick example, when we look at the procurement and so many other things that we need to be looking. The state legislation that we have only says at least 6% that applies to socially disadvantaged business, which is a big group. It's a catch-all process. And yet when you look at the data, the results that we see, only a handful of BIPOC communities are taking advantage of that. So that reflects that there's a big gap in what we say and how we do it and the resources that are going out, and yet we're not more inclusive. We have to be more intentional. We have to reach out to communities. We have to meet people where they are. Sometimes we tend to think that we put in legislation, everything will be working as we intended to. No, it doesn't. We have to be able to apply those pressures. We pass a lot of legislation. Sometimes we don't even remember when we come back, because there's a lot of things that we do. And it's really important that the connection between the community and the advocates and everybody else and the agencies and nonprofit, public, private, this is a collective process. We've all heard about it, but we need to be more intentional. And how we do it depends on how we draft that legislation and how we look into the impact on what we're trying to do.
So I would just say that I think the onus is not always on, in the procurement process, it's not always on the businesses who are there, who are not getting access to. We create laws and policies that are, and we've done it that way for so long that sometimes we're stuck and say that, this is the way it's done. And sometimes that's the problem, is the way it's always been done. Doing things the way it's always done, I would say is why we have such huge inequities and disparities. And so, we have to go back and look at those policies and change the laws and change the policies and change the process, so that we can create and allow a bigger number of BIPOC businesses or organizations to get those appropriations. And, I would, I have to use the racial equity impact assessment tools that came from the Voices of Racial Justice. I've been a long fan of them when the days that they had a report card, and they would just do a report card on every legislator around how you have been doing based on your votes and things like that. And I think we need that accountability back in place to hold legislators accountable, to help them who think that they may have been doing good stuff, who really have not. So I think that's one important thing. And I just believe in hugely, whether it's MMB or any other institution, if the diversity is not there to look at what you're doing so that you get different voices, different ideas on the table, then again, we fall short, because the only thing that comes to the forefront is the way that you're thinking about it and the way you see the solutions and the answers. I'm not picking on MMB a little bit, right? But that's for any institution, you have to have diversity. And so part of that racial equity impact assessment tool is to engage those specific communities in the analysis. You have to just, engage other people in the analysis of the process. You have to identify any current disparities and name the racial equity purpose of the policy and the laws. You just have to do it. Explain what the proposal seeks to accomplish and assess whether the policy can achieve or identify the equity goals. You need those tools in front of you. And if so, you have to adjust the policy to achieve a more equitable outcome. You just have to adjust it. And sometimes people have been in an institution for so long, is that they don't want to adjust. They believe it's not them, it's out there somewhere. That's the problem. And I would say it's not always the case. And then we have to ensure that adequate funding, implementation strategies, and accountability and mechanism are all in place. So having those tools in place, to having a racial equity assessment tool in place that can help those individuals or entities to do their work through a more of a holistic, comprehensive, inclusive manner is needed, because I'm going to make an assumption that we all want people to do well, right? We don't want to be known as the state with the greatest and the most disparities, but that calls for intentionality in the process. And so I am really happy to know that the Center for Economic Inclusion is working on those tools. You have clear partners who are doing that, but we need you to insert that into the work that we're doing every single day. Was it the state legislature? Was it in city council? Was it in county commissioners' work? Was it in the private sector? It doesn't matter. We need to do that because we can do better, but we have to be intentional in that process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to ask another question. This is for the assistant commissioner. We have a question that says, I was struck by something you said specifically, that we measure what is important to us, referring to data. How is MMB advocating for accurate disaggregated data collection in, say, the Department of Human Services to be able to accurately assess the levels of disparity in services and outcomes?
We're having a lot of questions. This is a great question. We're having having a lot of conversations about this great question at the state. And we recognize that state agencies are in very different places, and the state holds a ton of data. And that means that there are a lot of opportunities to evaluate, but will take a lot of coordination and a lot of energy to get everyone on the same page. And so we're thinking about that actively, about what that would look like and sort of what those standards would be. But in the meantime, when we are working with agencies to evaluate their programs, we spend a lot of time looking through the data to make sure we can evaluate the different impacts of programs on Black and Brown Minnesotans and white Minnesotans, urban, rural, so as much as we can, but sort of while in the meantime having a broader, longer range conversation about how we can move towards more disaggregated data. So thanks for that question.
Absolutely. I'm loving all these questions coming from our audience. A big thank you to all for each one of the questions that are coming into the chat in both arenas. We have another question that asks, how do we keep the momentum going around racial justice and racial equity impact notes at the legislature and within state and local government if we have a case where both branches change after the election, and if potential priorities should shift given new leadership?
The first thing that I wanted to remind everyone, we can still do this work no matter what happens on November 8th. This is something that is so important to all of us. So when we look at the racial equity impact notes, this next month, I think in December, hopefully, we're expecting to see the tax expenditure revenue commission's report. That was more intentional. We're looking at how much we're spending on a tax expenditure, because sometimes we talk about the money that we're spending at the state level, and yet we also give tax breaks and so many other things included in our bills. So for example, I think from the economic aspects of it, we do have the angel tax credit. So many people are familiar with that if they've been involved in business, but who's receiving that revenue in terms of a tax expenditure? So we need to keep on pushing and figuring out where's the racial equity in that process, from the Legislative Budget Office to MMB to DHS and everyone else. So this is something that we need to continue to do so no matter what happens. But the first thing that I think we have to look into is when we get the fiscal notes, we want to make sure that the assumptions and the findings include racial equity impact notes within them. So it's not a separate issue. This is the same bill that we will be talking about. And most of the time, we usually focus on the bill itself, but not the fiscal notes. The fiscal notes are as important as the bill. Sometimes we tend to go deep into how this will impact different agencies, different groups, and the outcomes that we're looking for. So the key point here is we're fighting for equity, but also outcomes that will reflect what we need to do as a state agency.
So how do we keep this momentum going, right, around racial equity? You have an awesome group of, I see 135 participants, probably more than that, who's on the phone and other things. So we need you. You know, when we learn something new, we share something new, and we become the messenger of that message. And so after November the 8th, we're going to know who our governor is, and our lieutenant governor and attorney general and all the legislature, and someone represent you. Right? You keep the momentum by engaging them, right? Or it falls off and no one thinks about it. We just do what we've been doing. And we don't want you to do that. So I'm asking you to keep the momentum is to share and bring that impact assessment into your conversations and say to them, this is important. This is important. The inequities that we're seeing in Black and Brown Indigenous community can be better. And this is a tool that we think that you can use that will be helpful in the process to looking at the outcomes that we want. Because at the end of the day, it's about the outcomes, not where we start at, but how we're going to end this. And we want to end this making sure that we see the diversity that in our state, and we are investing into that, into people's lives to make their lives better. Whether it's a small business, whether it is making sure we are closing the gaps in the opportunity and achievement gaps that we see in our schools, whether we are seeing more, not just more BIPOC businesses, but BIPOC businesses that are being sustained, right? We don't want within a year that, you know, we created 175 of them are no longer in business. So we need you, it's all in. We all need to be in. And so talk to your legislature, House and Senate, whether they're Democrat or Republican, we don't care. It does not matter. What we do care about is more fair and equitable outcomes for our family. And you have to be talking to people who you do not always see to agree with your worldview. And that's okay. You still need to have those conversations.
If I can just weigh in really quick, I want to honor the upcoming questions too, but I think the question of momentum is very serious and important, but I also want to make sure our response to momentum is right sized and that we're not reliant on momentum alone. And I think the answer to making sure this is sustainable is that momentum is used as a catalyst so we can systematize the work through change mechanisms such as RAIN. And so we're not dependent on the winds of political change or the next election cycle, and that the agenda is being set not for the next legislative session, but for the movement. And so I want to honor the power of momentum and seize it. But long before racism was a public health crisis, it's always been a public crisis, just a public crisis, right? And it always has been. And so I just want to make sure that we can seize momentum, but not be contingent on it as well.
Absolutely. I am so grateful for this conversation and all of the vast ground that we've covered in this. One of the final questions we have is actually from one of our partners and working group members, which is to highlight some of the recommendations that came from our working group in this report. And while those are featured in the report, I do on the first page, I want to highlight just some of those recommendations so that those of you who are participating in the call have an opportunity to dive deep in that and to work in solidarity with us, because we are going to be moving these recommendations forward as has been lifted by you all, no matter what the outcomes are of our next elections, because we believe that this is important and that all leaders who are representing all people have a responsibility to take this forward. And so as you look at the report today, again, on page 1, you'll see these recommendations and the conclusions from the report, which found that while several states do have racial equity impact notes, most of those states have begun to focus particularly on the opportunity for assessing the impact of crime bills. There's an opportunity to be assessing either all bills within a legislature or a particular governmental entity, or to be able to zero in on a particular arena. And our particular racial equity impact notes working group has determined that there's a particular opportunity in Minnesota to focus particularly on the economic impacts of people of color in the state of Minnesota, measured by cost, wages, income, jobs, or other indicators. And so the approach that we'll be taking is to explore those opportunities more deeply. And we believe that the impact notes in our state should compare the projected baseline without a bill, those conditions that exist without having that bill, to the future conditions that would exist if a particular bill were to be passed. We believe, based on the research that's been conducted, that there's an opportunity to examine if information already examined to produce a fiscal note can facilitate preparing that note. However, the racial equity impact note analysis would often need to include additional data. For example, fiscal notes often focus on the financial effects on state government, but racial equity impact notes would examine statewide impacts on businesses, workers, and households. It's important to also recognize that racial equity impact notes should be able to be prepared within weeks of a request by the state legislative budget office or another neutral group. Some might require 1 month or longer. Complex racial equity impact notes might also need to be prepared by universities, consultants, or other research organizations with specialized expertise. Advocacy regarding a bill is separate and apart from the process of preparing racial equity impact notes. And it's critical that these notes be performed in a neutral fashion, although the author should be able to rely on a wide range of information when preparing the note. In our report, you'll find 2 examples of racial equity impact notes. We share this information both to give you a taste of what you'll find in the report and encourage you to go read it, but more importantly, because you are all advocates of this work, and we want you working arm in arm with us in solidarity, because we know that everyone won't get on board right away, but we do believe that as people come to understand how racial equity impact notes work, what the value is of these tools in moving our entire state forward, and just how well they've worked in other states, that we can bring people forward in working in partnership with us to help our entire state prosper. I want you to join me in thanking these amazing ambassadors, policymakers, and partners for joining us on today and bringing their not only work forward, but also their ideas and partnership with us on today. Thank each one of you for what you're doing to make our state better and for your partnership on today. I want to thank each of our participants for joining us for this conversation on today, and for each one of you who raised questions on today. If there are ways that we can partner with you in your work and your organizations, please reach out to us at action@thecenterforeconomicinclusion.org. We'd love to continue partnering with us, and please stay for the survey link that will show on your screens just at the conclusion of today's forum. Thank you so much. Have a great day.